When a slave man saw his master's wife crying by the river in Georgia in 1834, what happened next shocked everyone. The plantation's strict hierarchy forbade these kinds of meetings, but something in Eleanor Thornton's sadness spoke to Elijah's humanity. What happened after he talked to her that foggy morning shook the whole county. But no one could have guessed that this moment of kindness, which was against the rules, would set off forces that neither the master nor the slave could control. Elijah slipped through the morning mist toward the river, just as the sun was coming up over the Georgia pines. The plantation would soon wake up to another day of hard work, but these short times spent gathering medicinal herbs before the overseer's bell were his only taste of freedom. As he walked quietly through the underbrush with a basket in hand, the wet ground under his calloused feet felt almost like a blessing. But when he got to the bend where wild yarrow grew the thickest, he stopped in his tracks. Mrs. Eleanor Thornton sat on a stone covered in moss by the water's edge. Her expensive silk dress, the pale blue one she wore for special guests, hung around her like spilled water. Her fragile shoulders shook with silent sobs that seemed to come from a place deep inside her that was broken. Every instinct and painful lesson he'd learned since he was a child told him to back off. A slave who knew that a white woman, especially the master's wife, was weak could get the lash or worse. People had been hanged for less. His heart raced as he started to back away, hoping the rustling leaves wouldn't give him away. But there was something about the way she was standing, with her fingers clutching a handkerchief that was already wet with tears, that made him feel something dangerous. Kindness. Maybe it was because he remembered how his mother cried like this when she had to leave his sister at an auction. Maybe it was just that, at that moment, she looked as stuck as he felt every day of his life. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" The words came out of his mouth before he could stop them, hanging in the foggy air between them like a crime that had been committed. Eleanor's head jerked up, her eyes wide with fear and then recognition. A single tear ran down her porcelain cheek and caught the first golden ray of sunlight that broke through the trees. For 3 heartbeats, all of the social barriers between them were in the air. Slave and mistress, black and white, property and owner. Then something amazing happened. She talked to him like a person, not like a master talking to a slave. "No, Elijah, nothing is okay." Her voice shook like a leaf in the fall, and every word showed how weak she was. "Things haven't been okay for a long time." The rushing waters that didn't care about the fake boundaries of men traded that simple truth. It crossed a line as deep as the river was. At that moment, something changed in the very foundation of their lives. They realized that they were all human, which was something that the whole structure of Southern plantation life was meant to keep from happening. Elijah moved his weight, and the herbs in his basket slipped his mind. He should go now. Being around her made things more dangerous every second. But his feet stayed where they were as she looked up at him with eyes that seemed to really see him. "You gather plants to heal," she said in a soft voice. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. "Before they—" She stopped herself, and another tear fell. "Before I got here." Neither of them could have known that those words and that moment of real connection would set off events that would shake the Thornton plantation to its core. That this chance meeting would have far-reaching effects, affecting many lives and bringing both terrible darkness and unexpected light. Elijah didn't know that this one act of kindness would soon put both of their lives in danger, as he carefully stepped closer to hear what she had to say next. That by dawn the next week, blood would be shed, fire would light up the night sky, and nothing on the Thornton plantation would ever be the same again. The Thornton plantation house stood tall and white against the Georgia sky. Its columned front hid the rot that was growing inside its walls. There were cotton fields for 600 acres in every direction, a kingdom built on broken backs and stolen lives. When Elijah got back to his cabin that night, he couldn't shake the memory of Eleanor's face covered in tears. It was like a ghost that wouldn't go away. What could make the mistress of such a grand place feel so hopeless? The question stayed with him through his small dinner of cornmeal and fatback and into his dreams, where Eleanor's blue eyes seemed to be begging for something he couldn't name. The overseer's bell woke him up too early, breaking up the little sleep he had gotten. 3 days went by in the same old way that life on the plantation did, working in the fields from sunrise to sunset, getting cuts on their fingers from cotton bolls, and hearing the overseer's whip crack nearby. Not on his back today, but the threat is always there. Elijah's mind was elsewhere, going over those few dangerous moments by the river, and every hour felt like molasses as he worked. On the 4th morning, while he was chopping firewood behind the kitchen house, a shadow crossed his path. This was an easier job for him because he knew a lot about herbs and sometimes worked in the main house. Elijah looked up from his axe swing and saw Eleanor standing there. She wore a simple day dress made of muslin with sprigs on it. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and she looked calm but pale as porcelain. She was holding a folded note in her shaking hand. She whispered, "My husband will be gone until sundown," and her eyes darted nervously toward the main house where servants might see them. "You need to see something. I can't handle it alone anymore. All of my instincts told me not to follow her." Elijah had been a slave for 32 years, but he was able to stay alive by knowing exactly where the lines were and never crossing them. Being alone with the master's wife wasn't just crossing a line, it was jumping over it into a bottomless pit. But curiosity and something he wouldn't even name in his own mind pulled him forward. "It's dangerous, ma'am," he said quietly as he carefully put the axe down. "Everything is dangerous," she said, her voice full of bitterness. "Especially the truth." They went through the servants' entrance, with Eleanor leading the way like someone who was used to moving around her own home without being seen. They climbed up narrow back stairs, and their footsteps were muffled by expensive carpet from England. Elijah had never been in this part of the house before. It was off limits to the family. He was sure that his heart would give them away because it was so loud. Eleanor locked the door behind them in Master Thornton's study. The room smelled like tobacco, leather, and beeswax polish. Every piece of furniture was carefully chosen to show off the owner's wealth and power. There was a picture of Master Thornton himself over the fireplace, and his cold eyes seemed to follow them around accusingly. "I found these last month," she said, pulling a leather-bound ledger out from under a loose floorboard by the window seat. "Robert's personal accounts, the ones he doesn't show to his business partners or even his bank." Elijah's blood froze in his veins as he looked over the pages she had opened for him. The ledger showed transactions that were much worse than buying land or selling cotton. It showed that people were smuggling people into the country through the coastal marshes, even though the federal government had banned the importation of slaves. Names, ages, prices, and profits. Some of the people who were reduced to inventory were men, women, and children as young as 7 or 8, and worse, much worse, chillingly accurate records of brutal punishments given to people who resisted or tried to escape. Deaths that look like accidents or illness, families that are split up on purpose to break their spirits, and breeding programs that are talked about in the same unemotional way that livestock are. "There's more," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking as she got to the last part. There was a list of names on the last pages, written in Master Thornton's careful handwriting. These were plantation owners from all over the county, state officials, and even a federal judge. Dates of meetings, secret messages, and amounts of money being exchanged. There is a conspiracy that goes far beyond these walls, with tentacles reaching into the very institutions that are supposed to enforce the few protections the law gives. If these men find out I've seen this, Eleanor's words hung in the air between them. The unfinished sentence was scarier than any threat that had been spoken. Why show me this? Elijah finally asked the question that had been bothering him since they got to the river. Why take the chance? When Eleanor's eyes met his, they showed a range of emotions that he had never seen in a white woman's face before. Yes, fear, but also determination, shame, and maybe even hope. Because I can't take it anymore by myself, she said in a low voice. And because you, she stopped, as if she were looking for the right words. Because I've seen how you care for others, like when you saved Bessie's baby when the doctor wouldn't come. You gather herbs and tell the kids stories. You see people as people. The brass handle on the study door suddenly turned against the lock. A harsh voice from the hallway called Eleanor's name. There were footsteps coming up to me, heavy, familiar ones. Master Thornton came back early from town. When the key scraped in the lock from the outside, their eyes met in fear. Elijah realized the terrible truth that would change everything in that heart-stopping moment. Knowledge was the most dangerous thing of all, and they now had enough to get them both killed. The door opened with a bang that made the hinges creak in protest. Eleanor's hands froze over the floorboard, where the incriminating ledger was still only partially hidden by the polished wood. Her face lost all color, and her fingers shook like leaves in a storm. Elijah stood still, knowing that being found out would mean certain death. Not a quick one, but one that would send a message to anyone else who dared to step out of line in the cruel hierarchy of plantation life. But the person in the doorway wasn't Robert Thornton. Martha, the elderly housekeeper who had worked for the Thornton family since before Eleanor got married, was the one who did it. She had the master key set as head of the household staff, and the keys hung from her worn-out hands. When she saw Elijah standing in the master's study, her eyes got bigger. Then they went to Eleanor, who was kneeling by the window seat with her expensive dress pulled around her on the floor. "Mr. Thornton's carriage just turned into the drive," Martha said in a low, urgent voice. "He came back early and is in a bad mood. He said something about trouble at the bank." No one moved for a heartbeat. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked loudly, and each second brought them closer to disaster. Then Martha's eyes fell on the partially visible ledger, and understanding began to dawn on her like the slow rise of the winter sun. She walked into the room without saying anything and closed the door behind her. The soft click of the latch sounded more final than a slam. "Whatever you're doing, do it fast," she whispered, as she helped Eleanor secure the floorboard. Her twisted fingers worked with Eleanor's thin ones to push the wood back into place. "I'll tell him you're lying down with a headache from the heat. Elijah, there are linens waiting to be brought up in the East Hall. Get to work on them." Just as the front door slammed shut below, Robert Thornton's loud voice called for Whiskey and his wife to come right away. The floorboard slid back into place with a barely audible thump. When he walked down the main staircase in his heavy boots, the sound made everyone in the room jump. "Go," Martha said, fixing Eleanor's dress and pinching her cheeks to make them look more colorful. "I didn't see anything. Nothing has changed in this house in 50 years, so there's no reason to change now." In the old woman's eyes, there was a flash of something that could have been solidarity or a warning. As Elijah slipped into the hallway, he quickly grabbed linens from the linen press nearby. He saw Martha's knowing look. The old woman had lived in this house for 50 years. She had seen and heard almost everything that had happened there, including many cruel things. But what side was she really on? Could they trust her silence, or would she speak up because she was afraid of the master's anger? He got downstairs through the servants' passage just as Robert Thornton got to the top floor. The master's angry questions about where his wife was faded behind him. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the well-kept lawn outside. The estate's beauty was a cruel joke on the people who worked to keep it that way. Elijah couldn't sleep on his thin pallet that night when he heard a soft scratching at his cabin door. He was on high alert right away because sounds like that at night usually meant trouble. He held his breath until a folded piece of paper slid under the rough-hewn door. He picked it up with shaking hands when he was sure no one was still outside. Eleanor's delicate handwriting wrote only 4 words on the note. The cellar, midnight tomorrow. He quickly burned the note in his small hearth, watching the fancy writing curl and turn black until it was nothing but ash. Even the smallest proof could send them both to jail. Dawn brought news that sent a chill through the whole plantation. 3 slaves had escaped from a nearby plantation in Wilkes County during the night. People from all over the county were bringing bloodhounds. There were twice as many patrols on all the main roads. This is the worst time for secret meetings or dangerous secrets. The fields were tense all day, just like the oppressive humidity that made shirts cling to backs and made it hard to breathe. The overseers were very watchful and quick to use the whip for even small mistakes. Elijah saw Robert Thornton talking to men he knew from the ledger's list twice. These men were powerful and had cruel eyes, and they looked at the workers like they were furniture or livestock. "They're scared," said Isaiah, an older man who worked in the row next to Elijah. "When mass is scared, we suffer. Something's going on, mark my words." Elijah had to make an impossible choice when night fell the next night. Meeting Eleanor meant putting everything on the line: his relative safety as a valued worker, the small freedoms he'd earned through years of careful obedience, and maybe even his life. But the ledger's secrets could be the key to something bigger than his own survival, knowledge that powerful could be a weapon if used carefully. The sound of hounds barking carried on the wind beyond the fields. This sound had scared enslaved people for generations. The patrols would be on high alert tonight, looking for anything out of the ordinary. As the moon rose above the treetops, it bathed the plantation in silver light that made shadows sharp and clear. Elijah waited with shaking determination until the last lamp in the overseer's cabin went out. He left his own home, staying in the darkest places and moving silently like a man who had learned that being invisible was often his only protection. Every step could give him away, and every breath seemed too loud in the still night. The main house looked like a pale ghost rising up in front of him, its columned front glowing in the moonlight. The entrance to the cellar was in the back, and you could get to it through the kitchen garden, where herbs and vegetables for the master's table grew in neat, straight rows. A dog barked in the distance as he crept past the smokehouse, making him stop in his tracks and his heart pound against his ribs. There was no going back now. What was in that cellar could be salvation or doom. As Elijah made his way to a meeting that would change the lives of many people forever, the pieces were in motion, and history itself seemed to hold its breath. Whatever happened in the next few hours would have effects that went beyond the Thornton plantation. It might even change the very foundations of the world they lived in, a world built on cruelty and division that might, just maybe, have the seeds of its own change. Elijah sent up a silent prayer to his ancestors whose names had been stolen, but whose strength flowed through his veins as he reached for the cellar door. The weathered wood felt rough against his calloused fingers. With a soft click, the latch opened, and he went down into the dark. With each step, he moved farther away from everything he knew and closer to a future he couldn't even begin to imagine. The smells of dirt, wine, and secrets filled the air in the cellar. Elijah slowly walked down the worn stone steps, each creak making him feel like he was going to be heard by the wrong people. The darkness felt like a heavy weight on his body, and the only thing that broke it was the faint light coming from deeper inside the underground chamber. His heart beat so loudly that it drowned out even the chorus of night insects that had followed him on his dangerous trip across the moonlit grounds. A single lantern cast long shadows on the rough walls, and as Eleanor stepped out from behind a row of dusty wine barrels, it lit up her face in golden light. The way the flame moved made her look almost like a ghost that haunted the base of her husband's empire. "You came," she whispered, her voice full of relief. She wore a plain dark dress and a servant's cap over her hair. If they were found up close, this disguise wouldn't offer much protection. Elijah could see the stress of the past few days in the fine lines around her eyes and the pale skin under her naturally fair skin. "I wasn't sure you would take the chance." "I had to know," Elijah said, staying away. Neither of them could fully afford to trust each other. He stayed close to the stairs, ready to run away if he had to, but it would be almost impossible to get away if they really found him. Tonight, there are twice as many patrols. Dogs are at the property line. Eleanor nodded sadly. Robert's been in a state since the Wilkes County escape. 3 men are gone, including the blacksmith he was going to buy next month. A hint of satisfaction colored her words, even though it was dangerous. "He thinks it's organized, and he should be afraid of it." She looked nervously at the stairs. "Elijah, Martha is with us. She's been with us for years, in her own quiet way." Her voice got even lower. 20 years ago, she helped my mother hide runaways in this very cellar. That was before Mother died and Robert took over the plantation. Before everything changed. Elijah felt this news hit him like a physical blow. The Thornton plantation used to be part of the Underground Railroad. It was hard to believe how ironic it was. Eleanor took out a small bundle from under her shawl. It was the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and something else, a folded map that had turned yellow with age and had worn thin from being handled many times. "Robert's part of something bigger than I thought," she said, as she spread the map out on top of an old barrel. As she put small stones on the corners, her fingers shook a little. "These markings show a network, underground routes for smuggling, safe houses, contacts in port cities. He and the others, they're bringing in hundreds of people illegally each year through the coastal marshes. The profit is enormous." Elijah looked at the map and thought about how the lines and symbols connected Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. Some of the notes were in code, while others were very clear about what they meant. Holding pen, capacity 30, deep water access, and patrol schedule. He slowly traced one line that followed the Savannah River inland and said, "These routes. People could use them in different ways." They understood each other through their eyes. The same paths that brought people into slavery could also lead them to freedom. Eleanor's voice got even lower as she flipped through the ledger to pages that Elijah hadn't seen before. "There's more," she said. 3 nights from now, there will be a meeting here with all 12 men from the ledger, including the judge and the sheriff. I've heard enough to know that they're planning something terrible. A coordinated response to the abolitionists' growing power in the North. Violence against even those who talk about freedom. They are afraid that what is happening in Massachusetts and New York could spread south. She turned to the next page, which had a list of names that made Elijah's blood run cold. These are their targets. People they think support abolition, like clergymen, newspaper editors, and even 3 plantation owners who they think are too nice to their slaves. Her finger stopped on a name circled in red ink. Adding my cousin William in Savannah, who has spoken out publicly against the cruelty he has seen. The effects were huge. There is an organized plot to violently silence even the slightest hint of freedom, not just smuggling and individual acts of violence. The Thornton plantation wasn't just a place where people were slaves. It was also the center of something much worse. The sound of a door opening above stopped them both in their tracks, Heavy, slow footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. Not Martha's lighter step, but a man's. Robert Thornton called out, "Eleanor," with annoyance in every word. "Are you down there? Answer me, woman." Eleanor pushed the map and ledger into Elijah's hands in one smooth motion. "Take these. There's a loose stone in the root cellar behind your cabin, third from the left corner near the floor. Martha will find you tomorrow with more information." She put something cold and metal in his hand. "Find the North Star if nothing else works. It's my father's compass." Now the footsteps were on the stairs, and each one brought destruction closer. Elijah slipped behind the big oak wine casks and pressed himself into the small space between the barrels and the damp stone wall. Eleanor quickly messed up her hair and grabbed an empty wine bottle from a nearby rack. He had spider webs on his face, and he fought the urge to brush them away while he put the important papers inside his shirt. Robert's voice had a hint of suspicion that made Elijah's blood run cold. "Why are you down here by yourself at this hour?" Eleanor said, "In the dark? I couldn't sleep." Her voice changed to the soft, slightly empty tone she used when her husband was around. It was amazing how quickly she went from being a conspirator to a fragile Southern belle. "Dr. Phillips told me to drink Burgundy for my nerves after my spell yesterday. You know how much I hate to bother the servants at night. They work so hard, poor things." Elijah barely breathed as Robert yelled at his wife for being stupid from where he was hiding. As the master walked deeper into the cellar, his boots scraped against the stone floor, getting dangerously close to where Elijah was hiding. Robert said, "You shouldn't be down here by yourself." His voice softened a little but still had an edge. "These are dangerous times, Eleanor. The black man from Wilkes County is still out there. Who knows what desperate things he might do." "Of course you're right, dear," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. She might have been afraid of being found out or disgusted by her husband's touch when he took her arm. "I wasn't thinking straight. The headache, you know. Come upstairs, and I'll have Martha get you laudanum." Robert leaned against the barrel closest to Elijah, which made a creaking sound. This made Elijah press deeper into the shadows. "That's strange," Robert said. "I could have sworn I heard voices." The silence that came after seemed to last forever. Elijah's lungs were on fire from wanting air. Eleanor finally said, "The old house settles, and the wind through the ventilation grates often sounds like whispers. It used to scare me when we first got married. Do you remember? You told me it was just the ghosts of Thornton's past keeping watch." Robert's quiet laugh broke the tension. "So I did. Come on, before you get cold in this damp." Elijah didn't move until their voices were completely gone, and the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. He held the valuable contraband tightly against his chest and waited 5 more painful minutes, counting each second before slowly coming out of his hiding place. The cellar suddenly seemed full of scary shadows, and every dark corner could hide another uninvited guest. Elijah moved quietly, like someone who had spent their whole life trying not to be noticed. He stopped at each step to listen for sounds coming from above. The clouds had covered the moon, making the night outside darker. This was a good thing for a man who needed to be invisible more than ever. The smell of rain in the air was another small blessing that might have covered up the sound of him moving around the grounds. As Elijah slowly walked back to the slave quarters, the burden he carried felt much heavier than paper and ink. It was knowledge that could end his life in horrible ways or bring down an empire of cruelty. He walked around the kitchen garden and stopped dead in his tracks when the back door of the main house opened without warning. A beam of light crossed the lawn and then disappeared when the door shut again. Someone had gone outside for a short time to look for something for him. Elijah stood still behind a big gardenia bush. The sweet smell of the flowers was almost too much in the humid night air. He kept going on his dangerous journey, staying in the darkest shadows, even though the house didn't move again. The slave quarters were a quarter-mile from the main house. This was close enough for convenience, but far enough to keep the illusion that the master and slave worlds were separate. On most nights, the distance felt like a small mercy. Tonight, it felt like an impossible amount of open ground to cover. The big house behind him was dark and silent, with the only light coming from the master's study on the second floor. There was uncertainty, danger, and maybe even the tiniest hint of hope ahead, something that had seemed impossible just a few days before. In the distance, a whippoorwill called 3 times. This was the sign that the night patrols were changing shifts. Elijah had 15 minutes to get to safety before new people would look around the area. They had 15 minutes to decide if the risk of rebellion was worth the certainty of staying in slavery. He had 15 minutes to choose between the devil he knew and the uncertain freedom that might be waiting for him beyond Thornton Land. The papers that were pressed against his skin felt like they were burning with their dangerous information. If they were found, it would mean certain death for him, Eleanor, Martha, and anyone else connected to this fragile web of truth. But they also stood for something he had barely let himself think about: leverage, power, and a weapon against the system that had taken his past and present. He moved through the shadows toward his cabin, using his memory and instinct to find his way through a landscape that had become dangerous because of circumstances. One thought burned brighter than fear. Some secrets were worth dying for, and this one might be worth living for. Just as he got to the group of slave cabins, the first big raindrop hit his cheek. The storm would wash away his footprints and force the patrols to find shelter. These were small mercies in a night that had already brought both terrible danger and unexpected opportunity. Elijah worked by touch alone to find the stone Eleanor had described in the root cellar behind his cabin. He felt the small bump and the edge that stuck out just enough to hold on to. It was surprisingly easy to get the stone out, and it revealed a small hole that must have been made generations ago just for this reason. He thought about how many secrets this plantation had buried over the years as he carefully put the ledger, map, and compass in the hiding place. He also thought about how many secrets were about to be found. He put the stone back in place and walked to his cabin door as thunder rolled through the sky. He didn't turn on any lights inside. Instead, he sat in the dark on the edge of his pallet while the rain drummed on the roof above. He couldn't sleep tonight because his mind was racing with both good and bad possibilities. 3 nights until the meeting of the plotters. 3 days to figure out what to do with information that could start a fire across the South. 3 times to talk to Martha, to find out more, and to make plans. Eleanor had said, "If all else fails, find the North Star." Elijah shut his eyes and thought about the night sky that he knew so well, the constellation that had led so many people to freedom. Maybe it would soon lead him to justice, not just away from slavery. Elijah made his choice as lightning lit up his small cabin in short, bright bursts. He would no longer be just a witness to history no matter what happened next. Freedom or death, victory or sacrifice. He would help with the writing. Morning came with the clear light that comes after a storm. As slaves walked out to the fields, their heads down and bodies already ready for work, the air was thick with moisture. The rain that fell all night had washed the world clean, but nothing had really changed. The same sun would burn them, the same overseers would drive them, and the same cotton would tear at their fingers until sunset gave them a break. Elijah was the only one who had to deal with something different and dangerous. As he joined the other workers, the muddy path to the fields pulled at their feet, making each step a little hard. Like tears soaking through old clothes, water droplets stuck to the cotton plants. Within minutes, Overseer Jenkins was cursing the wet weather that would slow down the day's harvest. He was in a bad mood and promised to punish anyone who didn't meet their quota quickly. Elijah got in line anyway, and he kept his face carefully blank so that no one could tell what had happened that night or what dangerous information was hidden under the floor of his cabin. His hands moved automatically to the task he was used to, while his mind raced behind a mask of submission that he had perfected over the years. As he worked the cotton bolls, all of the ledger's information, the map's revelations, and Eleanor's warning swirled around in his head. Isaiah whispered, "You look like you haven't slept," as they got into their seats next to each other. Even though the older man was hunched over, his eyes were sharp. Isaiah had lived through 3 masters by the time he was 63, and each one left scars on his back. He was the plantation's unofficial historian, and he remembered names and stories that other people had to forget. "Trouble? Just the storm?" Elijah said quietly, knowing that the overseer was watching them from his horse. Jenkins really didn't like Elijah because he could read and write and was a good carpenter, which gave him advantages that the overseer thought were unfair. "Thunder always keeps me awake." Isaiah's weathered face gave nothing away, but his fingers brushed Elijah's wrist in a way that was too deliberate to be an accident. "Martha sent a message. She said to tell you that the root vegetables need to be checked before they go bad." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. So Martha really did plan to get in touch with him and trusted Isaiah to get the message to him. He didn't know how many allies he had. They were all connected by whispers and small gestures that their captors were watching. He wondered how many other people might be in this hidden network and how many people who looked like they were following the rules were actually resisting. "Obliged," Elijah said quietly, making sure to keep his eyes on his work. "Don't want good food to go to waste." Isaiah nodded, but it was hard to see. "Storms have a way of uncovering what's been buried," he said. His words seemed to be about the vegetable cellar, but they had a weight that made Elijah look at him sharply. The old man's face stayed blank as he said, "Some things are meant to see the light eventually." Before Elijah could say anything, Jenkins rode closer, and the hooves of his horse splattered mud on their already wet clothes. "Less talking, more picking," he yelled, hitting his thigh with his riding crop as a threat. "You're already behind, and the day has just begun." They stopped talking and bowed their heads in the usual way to show they were submitting. Isaiah didn't say anything else until Jenkins had moved further down the line. His voice was barely heard over the sounds of work going on around them. "There's news from the Wilkes place," he said, his fingers never stopping their steady work. "Something happened there before the escape that has the white people more scared than usual." The day seemed to go on forever. The sun rose high in the sky and burned away the morning's dampness, leaving behind stifling humidity. Shirts stuck to backs, sweat stung eyes, and the never-ending rhythm of harvest went on and on. Elijah kept thinking about the hidden papers, Eleanor's warning about the meeting, and the terrible things that could happen in the future. Around noon, a wave of tension went through the field when Robert Thornton showed up on the main path with 2 men Elijah knew from town. One was a banker named Holloway, who had a gold-headed cane and a large body. The other was a plantation owner from the next county named Beaumont, who was known for being especially cruel to his slaves. Even though we couldn't hear them from the field, their conversation seemed heated, with Thornton pointing angrily at the main house. Naomi, a young woman working the row next to Elijah, said, "Something's got them riled." Even though she was only 20, she had a husband and child on a plantation 10 miles away. She could only see them on Christmas Day, but the separation had never dimmed the fierce intelligence in her eyes. Those eyes, which were always quick and observant, followed the men as they went into the house. Visitors came to the masters twice this week before noon. That's not normal. Keep your head down, Elijah warned, but he didn't forget what he had learned. Eleanor's meeting was clearly making waves even before it happened. Jenkins wants to find a reason to use that whip today. Naomi's face didn't change, but her voice had a hint of something more than just giving up. My grandmother always said, when the masters fight, it can be very dangerous or very good for us. The trick is to know which one is coming. Elijah was deeply moved by the wisdom in her words. The papers hidden under the floor of his cabin held both unimaginable danger and an unprecedented chance. The hard part was figuring out how to get from one to the other without destroying everything. As the shadows grew longer in the afternoon, something near the road caught people's attention. Riders came closer. 6 men, armed and with serious faces, were led by the county sheriff, a tall, skinny man named Holt, whose reputation for violence went beyond the borders of Thornton Plantation. The overseer left his post to meet them, and soon Robert Thornton himself came out of the house and walked purposefully toward the group. Work slowed down as every slave in the field tried to hear what was going on. Their hands kept doing their jobs, but their minds were elsewhere. The sheriff's voice could be heard in the quiet air. We found one of those Wilkes runaways. The other 2 are still missing. We think they crossed the river. We caught this one trying to steal a boat near Harper's Landing. Thornton's answer was lost as he walked the men to the house, but it was clear from the way he moved that he was upset. The meeting was brought inside, but not before a few of the riders gave the field workers long, suspicious looks while resting their hands on the pistols at their belts. Isaiah whispered, "They're scared," as work slowly started up again under the overseer's watchful eye. "White people only look that scared when they think we might be getting ideas," he said. Then he paused and added, "or when they know we already have them." The rest of the afternoon was spent in tense silence. After the sheriff's visit, even Jenkins seemed quieter. Instead of his usual insults and threats, he only gave grunted orders from time to time. When the bell rang to signal the end of the workday, everyone felt relieved, but they also knew that something bad was happening in the big house. Elijah walked back to his cabin at dusk, even though every nerve screamed with urgency. He needed to make sure the papers were still safe, find Martha, and get answers to the 100 questions that had been bothering him all day. His cabin, which was one of the better ones in the slave quarters because he was good at building things, was a little bit away from the others. This small privilege, given to him because his skills made him valuable property, had often felt like a mixed blessing. It made him more comfortable, but it also made him feel alone. But tonight he was thankful for the relative privacy. When he got to his door, he saw Martha waiting for him. She had a basket of mending with her, which was a common sight that wouldn't raise any suspicions because she was responsible for keeping the field workers' clothes in good shape. Her old fingers worked steadily to fix a shirt while she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. The meeting's been moved up. Tomorrow night, not 3 days from now, the sheriff brought news that has everyone in a panic. Her needle flashed in the fading light, and the small, even stitches hid the shaking in her hands. One of the men from Wilkes County was caught before they hung him. He said something that scared them a lot. Elijah asked, "What?" His throat was dry and his stomach was tight because he was worried about what would happen to the man who had escaped. Another person who had tried to break free but was pulled back and killed for being so brave. But even in death it seemed that he had still scared his oppressors. Martha's eyes were old and watery, but they were also sharp with intelligence. They met his for a moment. He told them it wasn't just a random escape. He said there's a network growing. He said even house slaves and trusted workers are part of it. He said the day of reckoning is coming. She spoke more quietly. They said they had friends and allies they never thought they would, even among the white people. The implications hit Elijah like a heavy weight. They believed him? Enough to hang him quickly so that others couldn't hear what he said? Enough to move their meeting up? Enough to double the night patrols again? She put down her sewing and leaned in closer, dropping the act for a moment. Elijah, they're planning something awful. Not just more security. Eleanor heard Robert say they were going to make examples and cut out the cancer before it spreads. Even though it was warm outside, he felt a chill run through him. Public executions. Mass punishments. Martha nodded sadly. For anyone who even thinks they might be sympathetic to runaways or abolition, they're talking about bringing in slave breakers from Charleston men who are good at finding and breaking up resistance. Her gnarled fingers, twisted from years of hard work, held his wrist with surprising strength. And that's not even the worst part. They want to sell families, split up mothers and children, and send troublemakers to the deep plantations in Louisiana where few people live for a year. Elijah shut his eyes for a second, feeling the horror wash over him. These kinds of actions weren't unheard of, but the way Thornton and his conspirators planned to use them over and over again was a new level of planned cruelty. Eleanor says we have until tomorrow night to act. After that, whatever they're planning will be set in motion. Martha's voice was more urgent than he'd ever heard it before. The papers you have aren't just proof of smuggling. They're proof of their whole operation, their finances, the bribes they gave to officials, names, dates, and amounts paid. If they got into the right hands, they could ruin them all. How should I act? Elijah asked, feeling like the weight of their situation was too much for him. What can we do against 12 powerful men? One of them is the sheriff. Even with these papers, who would believe slaves and a planter's wife when they say bad things about the most powerful men in the county? Martha's smile was small but strong. We use their assumptions against them, their blindness, their arrogance. She leaned in closer. Eleanor has a plan. Come to the kitchen door tonight after the house is dark. Tap 3 times, then wait, and then tap 2 more times. Elijah pushed. What does she plan to do? He knew that the longer they talked, the more likely they were to be found out. Martha picked up her sewing and got ready to leave, taking on her old role. Tomorrow, a man from Savannah will arrive. Eleanor's cousin William is the one who is marked as a target in the ledger. He doesn't know he's in danger. She sent him a message telling him to bring specific help. What kind of help? Martha's eyes shone with a fierce light that was not typical of her age. The kind that carries printing presses instead of whips. The kind that writes for northern newspapers about the evils of slavery. The kind that might be very interested in documents proving illegal slave trading and conspiracy among southern gentry. Elijah couldn't believe how bold it was. Here, abolitionists? William has connections through his shipping business. He trades with Boston and New York. For years, people have thought he was an abolitionist, which is why he's on their list. She stood up stiffly, her joints protesting the movement after sitting on Elijah's hard wooden stool. Eleanor thinks that if we can get the papers to these men before the meeting, they can take them north right away. Publication would ruin Thornton and his friends, and it might save a lot of lives. Martha's last words hung in the air between them as she picked up her things and left. Bring the papers and get ready. After tonight, things will never be the same. Elijah moved the loose stone and took out the hidden papers when no one was looking. He read them in the last light of day. The names, the roots, and the proof of a conspiracy all pointed to a web of corruption and violence that was much worse than he had thought. But even though this knowledge was terrible, it held the seeds of hope. These records could bring down the powerful men who made their money by making other people suffer if they got into the right hands. He carefully traced the lines on the map, following the coastal routes where ships brought people to shore, the inland paths where captives were taken to markets and plantations, and the places where people were kept like livestock. Each mark stood for dozens, maybe even hundreds, of lives lost for money. The ledger was even worse. It had detailed records of bribes given to customs officials, payments made to ship captains, and sales made to plantation owners. Names, dates, and amounts, everything about the economy of human slavery was laid out in neat handwriting, and on the last pages there was a list of enemies to deal with, which included Eleanor's cousin and others who had shown even the smallest amount of humanity towards slaves or spoken out against the institution. As night fell, the first stars appeared outside his window. 2 men from Wilkes County were still on the run somewhere to the north, holding on to the desperate hope of freedom. Eleanor Thornton was getting ready to betray everything she had been taught to believe in the big house. Isaiah and Naomi and others like them lived in the slave quarters with a quiet resistance that had never died out, even after generations of violence. Elijah had to make the most important choice of his life in this small cabin that was built by slaves. You can either risk everything now in a desperate bet for freedom and justice, or you can stay in prison and wait for a better time that may never come. The North Star shone brightly and steadily above the trees. At least for tonight, he knew what to do. He carefully put the papers back in their envelopes and put them inside his shirt, close to his heart. After that, he turned off his small lamp and sat in the dark, waiting for the plantation to fall asleep. As people stopped doing things, voices faded, and doors closed, the sounds of the night slowly changed. The barking of dogs happened less and less often. Then he got up, moving with the quiet precision of a man who had to stay hidden to stay alive. The 50 yards between his cabin and the main house looked like an ocean that he had to cross. Every step was heavy with 300 years of oppression. Every breath he took held the hopes of generations yet to come. As Elijah walked through the dark, he was guided by starlight and the strong will that had kept his people going through their long nightmare of being held captive. It felt like the future was hanging in the balance. He had slavery and all of its horrors behind him. In front of him, he might find freedom or death in his search for it. Martha had said that nothing would be the same after tonight, no matter what. The big house stood out against the night sky, and the white columns looked like ghosts in the moonlight that had come out from behind the clouds. Elijah came out of the orchard's shadows and used the fruit trees as cover until he got to the kitchen garden. The back of the house was plain and useful compared to the grand front that faced the road. This is where the real work of the plantation took place. Martha and the other house slaves worked all day to keep up the Thorntons' illusion of effortless gentility. The door to the kitchen was slightly open, and a small amount of light could be seen coming from inside. 3 taps, a pause, and then 2 more. Elijah's knuckles barely touched the old wood, but the sound was deafening in the quiet. The seconds felt like they would never end before the door opened wide enough for him to get in. "Quickly," Martha whispered, and she closed the door behind him without making a sound. There was only 1 candle in the kitchen, and it was hidden behind a pot so that its light couldn't be seen through the windows. The big fireplace, which burned from dawn to dusk most days, was now cold and dark. Martha led him through the kitchen and into the narrow servants' hallway that ran along the back of the house. "Eleanor's waiting in the study," she said. "Master Robert took laudanum for his gout and is sleeping heavily. The other house slaves are already in bed, and I've made sure that none of them will wake up before dawn." Elijah had only been in the main house a few times, mostly to work on the kitchen and the carpentry work he did in the public rooms. The servants' passage was a secret part of the mansion that only the people who worked there could use without bothering the people who lived there. He asked softly as they walked past closed doors where other house slaves were sleeping, How long has this been planned? Martha's answer was just as quiet. Eleanor's been waiting for a chance like this for years, ever since she found out what kind of man she married. Her voice became bitter. Of course, some of us knew from the start. We had no choice but to see him clearly. At the end of the passage was a small, unnoticeable door that Martha opened with care. The formal dining room was beyond, with its huge table shining dully in the dim light. Silver candelabras and crystal glasses were set up for breakfast the next day. They crossed quickly, and Martha led him to another door that opened into a study with wood-paneled walls and leather-bound books on the shelves. Eleanor Thornton stood by the window, her pale face tense with worry. She wore a plain, dark dress and had her hair braided and pinned up instead of the fancy way she usually wore it. She turned quickly when they came in, and you could see the relief on her face. "You came," she said softly. "I was worried you might change your mind after last night's close call." Elijah took the papers out of his shirt and said, "I brought what you asked for." The formality of calling her Mrs. had gone away, and for a moment they both forgot about their roles in the conspiracy. Eleanor took the papers with great care and spread them out on the desk that took up most of the room. She quickly read through the pages and said, "These are even more damning than I thought." How far it goes? 12 plantations, 4 judges, the sheriff, 2 state legislators, and even a congressman. All of them were involved in illegal slave trading and systematically silencing opposition. "What exactly is your plan?" Elijah asked, fully aware that every minute they spent in the house made them more dangerous. Martha said something about your cousin from Savannah. Eleanor nodded and picked up the papers again. "William is coming tomorrow, supposedly for a social visit. He doesn't know that Robert and his friends have marked him as an enemy yet." Her voice got harder. "They want to make an example of him. A respected merchant with ties to the North suddenly comes out as a supporter of black people and is dealt with accordingly." "Dealt with?" Elijah asked, but he already had a good idea of what the answer would be. "A staged accident, most likely. Robert has arranged such things before." The bitterness in her voice showed how much she hated her husband. "But William isn't coming alone. My letter told him to bring his friend Phillips from Boston. Phillips writes for abolitionist magazines and has ties to Underground Railroad operations in the North." Martha, who had been watching the door, quietly said, "If they can get these papers to Boston or New York and have them published, the scandal would be huge." Eleanor ended by saying, "For decades, it has been a federal crime to trade slaves. It would be impossible to stop if elected officials, judges, and law enforcement were involved." She looked into Elijah's eyes. "But the hard part is getting the papers to William without Robert knowing. He'll be watched as soon as he gets there." "So what do you want?" Elijah asked. A sound from above interrupted Eleanor's answer. A door opening and a floorboard creaking were heard. All 3 of them stopped moving and looked up at the ceiling. "Robert," Eleanor whispered, her face going pale. "He must have gotten up." Martha moved quickly and decisively, grabbing the papers and shoving them back at Elijah. She hissed, "The root cellar!" "Go now. Take the path through the south garden. The night patrol won't get to that area for another 20 minutes. Elijah stopped and looked at Eleanor. "Tomorrow, the orchard shed at noon," she said right away. "I'll find a way to meet you there." She straightened up, and in front of his eyes she became the plantation mistress again. "Go!" Martha led him back through the dining room as footsteps came down the main stairs. Robert Thornton's voice called out just as they were about to enter the servants' passage. "Eleanor? Is there someone down there?" Elijah's last view of Eleanor was as she walked toward the study door. Her voice had a perfectly calibrated note of sleepy worry. "Robert, dear?" Is your gout acting up again?" Martha then closed the door to the passage, and they hurried back to the kitchen in almost complete darkness, being careful not to make the old floorboards creak. The papers felt like fire against Elijah's chest, and he was scared of how quickly they could destroy everything. They got to the kitchen just as a bell rang from the main part of the house, which was the master calling for a servant. Martha's face got tense. "He wants me," she said softly. "Go. Quickly. Remember. Orchard Shed, noon tomorrow." She held his hand for a moment. "Be careful, Elijah. This is more important than just our lives." Elijah felt free as he slipped out the kitchen door and into the garden beyond. The moon was now higher in the sky, casting a stronger light over the grounds. He had to stay in the deepest shadows as he walked back to the slave quarters. His mind was racing with all the new information, how bold Eleanor's plan was, and how dangerous it was for all of them. William and his friend from Boston would come tomorrow. Somehow, the papers had to get to them without Robert knowing about it. Then, these men would have to leave right away with proof that could bring down not only the Thornton plantation, but also a whole network of power and corruption that stretched across several states. What comes next? Elijah had only been able to think about the short-term goal of exposing the conspiracy. What would happen to Eleanor when people found out she had betrayed them? To Martha, who had helped her? To himself and the other slaves when their master's crimes came to light? Freedom was still an idea that people could only see in dreams and hear about in whispers. But for the first time in his life, Elijah could almost feel how real it could be not just for him, but for everyone who was in chains. If the papers got to the North, if they were made public, and if the scandal that followed forced action. There are so many ifs, so many ways things could go wrong, and so many lives at stake. The slave quarters came into view, dark and quiet in the cold light of the moon. Elijah slowed down and looked around for any sign of the night patrol. Not finding any, he quickly went to his cabin, slipped inside, and locked the door behind him. He could only breathe fully after that, when he could feel the weight of what had happened. He thought the conspiracy was bigger and worse than it really was. The response that Thornton and his friends had planned, which included the examples they wanted to make, the families they wanted to break up, and the lives they would ruin to keep their power, was the most calculated form of evil. But there was an unlikely group of people who stood up to this darkness. A carpenter who was born into slavery, an old house servant, a plantation mistress who had found her conscience, a merchant from Savannah, and a writer from Boston. 5 people fighting against a system that had been around for generations, had the law and violence on its side, and had crushed many other attempts to fight back. The odds were stacked against them. The risk was huge, and the cost of failure was too high to imagine. Elijah put the papers back where he found them, under the loose stone. Even though he was upset, he moved carefully and on purpose. Tomorrow, William would arrive, and there would be a meeting at the orchard shed. They would try to get the evidence to people who could take it away from Thornton and his conspirators. Tomorrow could bring either freedom or death, or maybe both. He lay on his pallet in the dark, unable to sleep because his mind kept racing. The North Star shone brightly through his small window, just like it had for many other people who had looked to it for guidance on the dangerous path to freedom. Find the North Star if nothing else works, Eleanor had told him when she gave him his father's compass. The simple tool was now next to the hidden papers, and its needle pointed straight at magnetic north, which was freedom. Elijah made a serious promise to himself and to all those who had suffered and died in slavery as the night grew darker around him. No matter what happened tomorrow, he would make sure the truth came out. The papers would get to the North. The plot would be found out. And maybe, in that light, the first light of a new day will